This week's portion is the portion of Miketz, and in it you have the famous meeting between Yosef and his brothers. Now when it comes to the meeting, the Torah says that Yosef recognized them. They did not recognize Yosef. Now there are many reasons why they didn't recognize him. You have, obviously, they thought he was a slave, and this guy is a viceroy of Egypt. He actually had a different name, an Egyptian name, but most importantly, his appearance. That's why they didn't recognize him. We know that, clothing say a lot about the person, especially a king. His clothing say a lot about him. And especially in Egypt, where they were very much into their clothing and the robes and the style and the color. So because of the clothing that he was wearing, they could not recognize him. Now, if you think about it, going back, throughout the portions, clothing has come up a lot, and something about clothing seems to trick people. Now, there are 5 different cases. The first one, if I remember correctly, was Yaakov. Yaakov puts on his brother's clothing to trick his father Yitzchak in thinking that he was Esau. That's one instance. Another instance is that Joseph, his brothers, take his robe, which they were jealous of because his father gave it to him specifically. They dip it in animal's blood, show it to their father to trick him in thinking that an animal devoured him and it wasn't their fault. Third case is Yehuda and Tamar, where Tamar dresses up as a prostitute, and wants to trick Yehuda into having relations with her. Again, another instance of clothing tricking people. The fourth case is, again, with Yosef and Potiphar. Potiphar grabs Yosef's clothing when Yosef tries to run away, and with that piece of clothing, she tricks other people in thinking that Yosef tried to rape her. The fifth and last case is the case that I just mentioned about Yosef in front of his brothers. Because of his appearance, because of the things he was wearing, the royal Egyptian clothing, he tricked them and they did not recognize who he was. The bottom line about clothing is that things are not necessarily the way they seem. That clothing gives off a different appearance, a different message. In fact, the Hebrew word for clothing is beged. And those 3 letters, Beis, Gimel, Daled, that root word is found also in the word bagadnu, that we say every day when we confess. It means betrayal. Ashabnu, I sinned, bagadnu, I have betrayed you. Because you see that connection between clothing and betrayal. Clothing not necessarily shows what's really going on the inside. There was actually this 19th century Jewish historian, Heinrich Graetz, and he explained the difference, and I'm going off a little tangent over here, but I'll get back to what I was saying before. He explained the difference between other cultures and Judaism. And he said, and I'll quote, "The pagan perceives the divine in nature through the medium of the eye, and he becomes conscious of it as something to be looked at. On the other hand, to the Jew who conceives God as being outside of nature and prior to it, the divine manifests itself through the will and through the medium of the air. The pagan beholds his God, the Jew hears him, that is, apprehends his will." Now going back to these 5 cases about the clothing, the key behind those 5 cases can be found later on in Jewish history when it comes to the time when the Jews need to appoint a king over them. So you have, for example, King Shaul. King Shaul, it says about him that he looked like a king. His appearance, he was tall. He looked very good and prestigious, something that would be befitting for a king. However, it says of Shaul, what was going on in his own personal life, that he followed the people rather than lead the people. He had the power to be king, but he didn't believe in himself. Now, when it came to appoint another king after Shaul, when it came, let's say, to appoint King David, so they were looking around, they weren't even thinking of King David, and God had to tell them, no, I don't want you guys looking out for people who may look like someone who fits to be the king. I want you to go to King David because he, although he doesn't look like a king, he actually believes in himself and can actually lead the people. So the message is clear. Appearance means nothing. You look in the Torah doesn't really stress on people's, appearances. It does actually a pretty bad job at describing people because it's not supposed to describe people. It doesn't say how Avram looked, the color of his hair, the color of his eyes, how tall he was, or how Moses looked. None of that, because we don't care about appearance. Not that, we should all look bad or whatever. We should look as, we tend to look pretty good, so we should look good, but not care so much and stress on that, and as that being the main thing. So now going back to Joseph meeting his brothers, it says Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. The reason they did not recognize him is that from the start, they followed their feelings. Their feelings are what guided what they saw, which is the coat of many colors that inflamed their envy of their youngest brother. In other words, judge by appearances and you will miss the deeper truth about situations and people. You will even miss God himself, for God cannot be seen, only heard. That is why the primary imperative in Judaism is Shema Yisrael, listen, O Israel. And why when we say the first line of the Shema, we place our hand over our eyes so that we cannot see. Appearances deceive, clothes betray. Deep understanding, whether of God or of human beings, needs the ability to listen. Good Shabbos.